Today we're going to be talking about how to get your needs met in a relationship. So, if you are in a relationship and you want to have your needs met, then this video is for you. Before we get started, though, I'm going to ask you a favor. I'd like to ask you if you're getting value out of these videos. I'd like to hear from you in the form of comments and questions, or reach out through email or whatever. But I'd like to know what you're experiencing as a result of these videos. It would be a very good encouragement if you would kindly consider subscribing to the channel. Of course, sharing the videos and liking the video, those are things that you already know to do, and we've been getting a lot of that feedback as well. But I'd like to hear your comments more importantly, because then we can engage in a dialogue, particularly about such an important subject as having our needs met in a relationship. So let me start off this way, getting into the topic, right? Let me start off this way. One of the things that I have always enjoyed since I was a child was the whole notion of a wedding. I remember as a kid going to a wedding. You know, I used to think that that was the most unbelievable thing. And I used to ask my grandmother, what does this mean? I was a little kid, but what does this mean? And the idea that these two people have chosen to spend the rest of their lives together. Presumably that's the idea of a marriage, of a wedding, right? And that has always called my attention since I was a very young kid. How can this be? How can this work? How can this even exist? And I started paying attention. Something that as a kid in Brazil, when you went to a church and people were getting married, none of the kids were actually listening to the priest. I grew up in a Catholic environment in Brazil, and so we went to Catholic churches back then. And, the last thing a kid would do is pay attention to the priest. I mean, you're kidding, that's so boring. But I was intrigued by what was going on. And of course, much later, many years later, I started helping single people find their mates, because I struggled with that idea of finding my mate, finding my person, finding my soulmate, that kind of thing. And I took a liking for that topic, and I helped a ton of people find their mates. And people started asking me, well, can't you marry us? So I started doing that as well. So when I would marry a person, I wouldn't do a written ritual. I wouldn't use anybody's ritual. I would write my own. And I took a liking for that, and I would meet with them several times, and I would understand what that ceremony or that event meant to them, and I would write a ritual that was unique to them and that meant something to them. The symbolism that we used and so forth was specifically directed toward that couple and what's important to them. And I, if I may say so myself, I thought they were great rituals, and certainly the feedback that I got was that they were touching and moving ceremonies because they were so precisely tailored to that particular couple. There's this idea of, in Catholic weddings, and this is why I told you this whole story, where they would say, are you willing to take this woman as your wife? And in the Catholic wedding, they always say this, and forsake all others. And to the woman, they would ask, are you willing to take this man as your husband and forsake all others? So over the years, both as a man, as a therapist, as a coach, and as somebody who married quite a few people, I've thought a lot about this idea, forsaking all others. And most of you know I have a background in the study of Kabbalah, and Kabbalah has a lot to say about relationships and marriages. Kabbalah has a lot to say about everything, of course, but particularly about relationships and marriage, right, as you can well imagine. So this idea of forsaking all others has always been throbbing in my mind whenever the subject of relationships come up for me. And initially, of course, the interpretation of that phrase is obvious. Well, if I marry this woman, I forsake all other women, meaning I'm only going to devote myself to this woman, I'm only going to have sex with her, I'm only going to procreate with her, I'm only going to buy her special gifts. In other words, it's a very exclusive sort of relationship, and presumably she will reciprocate by only being with me. That's the idea of forsaking all others, right? Now, for me to marry a couple and talk about forsaking all others would be equivalent for me to ask you not to steal. And you might say, dude, why are you telling me this? I don't steal, you know? I mean, it's like, yeah, you know, it's assumed that a normal, decent human being who is not a psychopath wouldn't be stealing from other people. It's assumed. It's taken. We take that for granted. So people tell me, well, what about if you decide on having an open marriage? I don't. You know, that's different, because if the couple decides that that's what's right for them and they truly agree with that idea, then that's a part of their relationship. It's not what I'm talking about, because even in those so-called open relationships, there is an agreement that certain things or there's a certain zone that nobody else enters, right? So there's still a forsaking of all others when it comes to a certain core of what that relationship means to that person. And I'm not debating whether this is a good idea or a bad idea. I'm not proposing or discouraging people from having that. I'm just discussing the philosophical aspects of forsaking all others and attempting to expand this idea beyond having sexual intercourse with a different person other than your spouse, which I would assume that for most marriages is a given. For most people, that's a given. You know, it's, you start dating, and at some point you say, okay, let's be exclusive. And people use that word, and people discuss this, and there's this understanding that we're going to continue being exclusive. That could change later in life if they decide to, but it would have to be by mutual agreement, not by quote-unquote cheating, which would be, you know, the case if they were hiding, right? So, okay, so the idea of forsaking all others, I want to expand beyond the idea of interacting with other people. I want to bring that idea back to the self. So here it is the I, right? This philosophical concept that doesn't quite exist. Me, I, as an individual. And I say it doesn't exist in therapy because we're not individuals. Listen to the word indivisible. We're divisible. In other words, we're many things. There are many parts to us. But let's say that we're going to leave that concept aside for a moment. Let's take this thing that we call the I, which is mostly a character in a movie that we call life, because it isn't really the totality of what any of us is. There's a lot more to you and I as a soul, as a divinity, as an expression of divinity. But then there's this I, this person experiencing life here on this earth, and to a certain extent we're constrained to this particular experience. So you take that I, you take that person, and you say, okay, I married this other person, and now I'm going to forsake all others. And I'd like to encourage you to consider the following, that when we make that commitment, what we're really forsaking, besides other women or other men, is ourselves. The Kabbalistic, the deeper meaning of marriage is precisely the forsaking of me as an individual in order to become something much bigger, which is a big portion of this marriage. So think about this for a second. If I choose to marry someone and I choose to forsake all others, in that group called all others, there's an entity in that group. When I say all others, I'm not just talking about that woman, and that woman. I'm also talking about this guy. So the whole meaning of marriage in this context, in this Kabbalistic context, is to forsake all others, including me and my needs. That is the only way that marriage can possibly work. And why do we say that? Because from a Kabbalistic perspective, from a spiritual perspective, the whole idea is to transcend personhood or humanness and engage with our divinity. We have to transcend. We have to go beyond the character in the movie called me and go into and discover who the actor behind the character is. So when you watch a movie, you're watching a human being, an actor or an actress, portraying a character, but you don't believe for a moment that the person you see on the screen is that character. John, Peter, Paul, Mary, Beth, whatever. You know that it's an actor or an actress representing a character. You and I are the same. This is a movie theater that we're living. We just call that life. And there's this idea in philosophy that we call consensus reality, because we kind of agree that this world over here is kind, you look behind me, you see a tree. I look behind me, I see a tree. So we agree, there's a consensus that there's a tree there, so we call that reality. In reality, there's a tree there. But it's all a matter of perspective, because if we get a really powerful microscope and we look into that tree at a very small scale, there's mostly empty space. And at that point, I could ask you, well, is there a tree there or not? So a tree would only be a construct of our imaginations when we look at the clump of energy, and our brains interpret that as a tree. But I'm not trying to get abstract here. I'm talking about relationships. What I'm saying is that because we are a character in a movie, to a very large extent, because we are a character in a movie, the whole point of life is to transcend that and discover who we really are. We're not what we think we are. And the whole quest is, who am I really then? If I'm not this character, what am I, or who am I? That's the whole adventure of life. Well, marriage is an excellent venue for that purpose, because by definition, we forsake all others, including me. So in our modern society, the idea of forsaking me in favor of a marriage is considered ridiculous. And you watch 1,000 movies by all the gurus nowadays, and they all say, no, but you have your needs, and you have all this number of needs, and you have 6 needs, and you have 10 needs, and you have 18 needs, and you have to have your needs met, and if you can meet your needs and your needs, and it's all about me, my need, my need, my need. And, characters who emphasize having your needs met, usually only trying to meet their needs, and they don't really care about your marriage, if you think about it, because the very foundation of a marriage is the forsaking of all others. So then you say to me, okay, fine, I'll do that, but my husband doesn't do that, my wife doesn't do that. So if I forsake myself, they trample over me, and I no longer have a life. Well, this is a different conversation, because if what that person is saying, or if you're feeling this way, is true, you're not really married. You don't really have a bilateral commitment to the forsaking of all others, if it's true. Oftentimes, it's not exactly what's going on. That's why we do therapy. We talk to couples. It's not quite like that. There are two versions. It's a difficult thing to dissect and unpack. But if it is actually true that I'm in a marriage and I'm forsaking all of my needs in favor of the marriage, right? Because let me open a parenthesis here. When a couple comes in, and a married couple comes in, let's say, right? And by the way, when I say marriage, I'm not even referring to the legality of it, if you signed the paper or not. I'm referring to, okay, we're in a committed relationship, long-term, that kind of thing, right? So more of a spiritual definition of marriage, not so much a legal definition of marriage, which after all is just a contract at the courthouse that can be done and undone. So that's not exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that internal spiritual commitment to a life process that is very different from the life process of a single person focused on his or her own evolution. It's a different life, it's a different path in life. So when a couple comes in, I always tell them, look, there are 3, if I take you on as a client, I'm taking on 3 clients. 3. I'm taking on one party, let's say the husband. I'm taking on the wife as a client, because we got to work with individuals. But there's a third entity here that we call the couple or the marriage. And when you're here together, I'm not treating or addressing your needs or your needs. I'm addressing the couple's needs. And the only way those sessions are going to work, and the only way the marriage at large is going to work, is if both of you are willing to forsake your personal needs. So then a person will tell me, that's where this conversation comes up. They tell me, yeah, I'm willing to do that, but my husband isn't, my wife isn't. They're selfish. I'm not, they are. So then we have to get into individual conversations, because that could be a projection, that could be our perception, that could be all kinds of other things. But let's suppose that at the end of much analysis, we discovered that it is true. You have one party willing to forsake him or herself, and the other party perfectly selfishly only concerned about his needs or her needs. Then we don't really have a marriage. You have to recognize that in this definition we don't, because we don't have this bilateral commitment to forsaking all others. So that would probably not work. I don't know. It could work, but it would become more of a service to the other party. I don't know. That's a different conversation. I'm talking about in the regular situation where both parties are committed to forsaking all others. And then you say to me, okay, fine. I'm willing to forsake all others, including myself. My wife is willing to forsake all others, including herself. So now we're both committed to the marriage. Well, what about my soccer game on Saturday mornings? I like to play soccer with my buddies, so I cannot do that. That's a need of mine. I get enjoyment from that. See, that's the thing that's funny, right? We're afraid of forsaking ourselves because we think that if we do, the other person is going to trump us. The other person is going to walk all over us. No more soccer game for you. That's it. You're done. Again, if the person were to impose that upon you, they're not forsaking themselves. If there's love there, what the other person is going to say is, okay, what's important to you? And you would say, in this example, dude, what's important to me is to play soccer on Saturday mornings. But you're my priority. I'll give up the soccer game for you, for the marriage, but that's what I really like to do on Saturday mornings. Person loves you, they'll say to you, dude, I would never want you to give up your soccer game on Saturday mornings because I love you. You see? And then you would reciprocate by asking, all right, so what about you? What's important to you? And I'm making all this up, right? But you get the point. You have to apply this to your situation. Person would say to you, in this case would be the wife, and she would say, yeah, what's important to me is to go to the hairdresser once a week. I don't mean to make this a stereotype. I'm just giving you an example that comes to my mind. As you can tell, my videos are not scripted. I do this all day long, and all of this stuff is fresh on my mind. And these are just examples that come up all the time in real therapy with real people. These are not made up stories and scripted stuff that I'm using to sound good. I'm just telling you how it is, raw, no scripting. So the person says, oh, what's important to me is to go to the hairdresser once a week. But you know what? I'm willing to give that up. I know it's expensive. We don't have the money in the budget. The guy in this example would say, absolutely not. If that's important to you, I'm going to give up on my beer on Fridays so that you can go to the hairdresser, whatever. You see the point I'm making? So there's what prevents us from forsaking our own needs in a committed relationship is the fear that we're not going to be reciprocated, and then couples get into this stalemate. Yeah, I'll give up the soccer game, but she didn't give up the hairdresser. She doesn't let me go play soccer, again, in this example. And I'm telling you that the whole point of this is to dive in head first and forsake yourself and give all of what you have, because otherwise you're never going to know. And then you tell me, you're never going to know if it works or not, if it's true or not, if love exists or not. You're never going to know. You think you know, but you will never know. Because, like A Course in Miracles says, if you don't do it this way, all you're going to have is what A Course in Miracles calls a special relationship, which is an exchange of favors. I do this for you if you do that for me. That's not really the love that we're talking about yet. That's an exchange of favors. That's what A Course in Miracles calls a special relationship, not a holy relationship yet. There's more for you there. So then you say, okay, but what about my needs, right? What if I cannot play soccer? Again, in this example, and you substitute for whatever is real for you. What if I cannot play my soccer? And what I'm telling you is this, even if you have to give up on the soccer game, what you're going to discover on the other side, as we embrace the love in the way that we're describing here by forsaking yourself, what you're going to discover is a much bigger and better life. Much bigger and better life, because the experience of dissolving some of those boundaries and joining another human being at the heart and soul level is so powerful, so magnificent, that if you have to give up a soccer game, it's well worth it, I guarantee you. And I'm not suggesting you do give up your soccer game. I'm simply saying that even if it came to that, what you got is way more valuable than whatever else you think you lost or gave up on. Now, it's interesting because this notion has been represented in philosophy, in religions, throughout human history. And we make movies about this, and everybody wants that kind of relationship. And we as a society are really good at pretending that that's what we're living. Oh, they're a power couple. Oh, they're such a good couple. We're good at creating, especially now with social media, we post all these pictures and we're always hugging and kissing. And because why? Why are we always pretending that that's what we're living when I know that's not the reality? Statistically, it's not the reality. And at the office, we know it's not the reality. I know, it's a difficult proposition, a marriage, right? So we know the very same couples that are posting cute pictures on social media, they're not exactly living that experience, but they're portraying that publicly. And the question is why? We portray that because we actually value it. If we didn't value that idea, we wouldn't attempt to portray it. So we value it. We value that. We want that. We just don't know how to get it. And may I kindly suggest that you consider that the way to have your needs met on a much bigger scale than you possibly imagine is actually by forsaking your needs initially. I know it sounds contradictory. May I please ask you to consider this possibility? And if you have questions on this topic, please put on the comments below so we can engage in a dialogue, and I'll be happy to explain further. But let's just let that sink in a little bit, see if that makes any sense to you. Blessings to all of you.